I'm a management professor. I do multi-level research, so I do research at the individual and the organizational level. And based on the conversation, so I just arrived yesterday afternoon. I managed to make it to the very last panel of the session yesterday, and I saw that there was a lot of discussion at the individual level, and somewhat there were a lot of questions about the larger context in which people are working with AI, and that will be my primary area of focus. I'm going to try to contextualize what we were talking about yesterday. First, basically, I'll do this in 2 chapters. I'll have just a little bit about how individual learning changes as we move from human learning to human plus AI learning. And in that context, I'm going to focus on when humans retain agency. So this is when AI is not controlling them, but rather they get advice from AI and have the choice of whether or not, of whether and how to use AI. And also, my focus is on learning, but learning on the job, learning by doing. And there is sort of an overarching framework existing, this is not my framework, it's Dreyfus's framework, but it is a framework that lays out how adults, people with expertise, learn, and how that differs from how novices learn. And novices, so in general, basically, the level of guidance, the Dreyfus model sort of argues that people start out as novices, and as novices, it's like what we do in school. You're learning by you have textbooks and instruction, and there's heavy guidance, so it's primarily like heavy levels of guidance, and your skill starts out very small. But gradually, as you progress to advanced beginner to competent proficient, then what happens is you create more of a broad mental model where the knowledge that you have is connected, integrated with one another, and it shifts you from rote learning to more intuition-based learning. So you end up having a larger sort of, once you're an expert or even proficient, you already have a number of skills, and then any new learning it has to be basically hooked on to the existing mental model that you already have. So when we think about people learning on the job, we are thinking about people who are on the job with AI. So if we want people who are already working, maybe already professionals, already have expertise, and we want them to be using AI to learn and working differently with AI, they are in that top category. They are already experts, and they already make most of their decisions based on intuition. They have an expert intuition, an integrated mental model that they already base their decisions on. And that changes the learning process. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how. My very first project it was in 2020, the first NSF grant that I received, and it was an AI tool that was designed to help doctors make decisions about COVID patients. This was valuable because, and here's a quote from one of the doctors that we spoke to, doctors realized that all kinds of decision-making about COVID they were accustomed to making decisions about disease, about treating patients, based on the intuition that they had developed as in practice for many years as medical doctors. And it was informed by scientific discovery, scientific knowledge. But they realized in the context of COVID that we had to accept that because this was a new disease, the scientific method takes time to understand how something works. They didn't have guidance initially to figure out how to make decisions, and they were aware that COVID was very different from many of the diseases that they were familiar with. For example, the things that they would normally look at to indicate how sick someone is, a key thing for doctors is sick or not sick, getting better or getting worse. That's a key decision making. And it was very hard for them to make decisions about COVID patients because they couldn't tell if patients were getting better or getting worse. They would rely on what they call inflammation markers, so indicators of sickness, of inflammation, that your body is fighting a disease. And these inflammation markers were going in opposite directions to one another and not sending a clear enough signal. I am at NYU, so we're in New York City. We were kind of ground zero for the COVID pandemic. And one of the biggest issues is that doctors were too afraid to discharge patients from the hospital because they were afraid that a patient who seemed to be getting better might be sent home and get worse and die. What they were finding is that, they call it decomposition, that a patient who seemed totally fine within 2 hours would need to be, if the inflammation started up, within 2 hours they would be sick, and 2 hours later they would need to be intubated, and death would often come pretty quickly afterwards. So it's very hard for them. On the other hand, at the same time as they were afraid to send patients home, there were new, sicker patients coming to the hospital, and then there was no space to admit them. So you were really making the choice between life and life. And the first project that I worked on was a COVID prediction model to try to identify and give doctors some guidance about are these patients able to be sent home or not. The way that we implemented the COVID model basically identified patients who were at low risk and therefore could be discharged, and we implemented it as a randomized control trial, where for each individual patient, we randomly chose 50% of patients, the doctors would get the COVID recommendation of their risk level, and for 50% of the patients, they would not get that information. And we were looking to see, were they quicker to discharge patients who based on the prediction model were getting better. And in the first 3 months, we found that the blues, the blues are the unmasked, so that's when they had the prediction model for that particular patient. Those patients were being discharged from the hospital faster than the patients that they did not have the guidance from the AI model. So that's great. That was exactly what we were expecting. And that was in the first 3 months. However, then we looked at the second 3 months, and that was actually a second wave of COVID. We had multiple waves of COVID in New York City. So we had a first wave of COVID, and then this was the second wave of COVID. And already by the second wave, there was no difference between the discharge rates for patients where it was masked versus unmasked. And moreover, doctors were keeping the patients in the hospital for longer. But the key thing is no significant difference. And what we heard from the doctors is, yes, the model was very helpful at first. We learned from the model what to pay attention to, but then basically we started to realize, I've already learned what the model has to teach me. Now I know what to look for. And I started to realize what the model was saying was the same as my intuition, because I had incorporated the model's information into my intuition, so then I don't need to look at it anymore. And moreover, they wanted to get rid of these models because they experienced it as, I don't want my boss to be like, the computer says this patient can be discharged today and you're not discharging them, why not? They didn't want the accountability and they want accountability is fine, but the responsibility, the oversight and the diminished autonomy. The key thing is the diminished autonomy that comes when you have an AI model. And so in practice, these models, people are learning from the models, but they learn from the models. What we found, which was kind of surprising, is that here is a model that everyone said is useful. It's very useful. They learned from it, but then the more it was useful, but because it was useful, they learned from it and wanted to get rid of it, stopped using it. And so this process, normally, if something's useful, you keep using it. In this case, they didn't. What we started to realize, and here's some of the kind of recent research that I'm doing, is that AI is not just, we've been talking a lot about how AI is a realistic threat. AI may be replacing humans, that it may affect the jobs that we have access to, how much we get paid, how our performance is evaluated, but it also is a symbolic threat. In particular, so a little bit of background from a theoretical perspective is that we know that it's very important to professionals to have a professional identity, to think of themselves as professionals. And what it means to have a professional, along with professions, professions are defined by prototypes, an embodiment of what it means to be a professional, what it means to be a doctor, what it means to be a writer. And these prototypes are based largely on expertise. So someone who is an expert, remember in that Dreyfus model? So if you're a knowledge worker, you are more likely to be threatened by AI. You know, your capabilities are potentially replaced by AI. And that sense that AI could be, basically the key thing is AI, you are threatened, if you're a professional, if you're an expert, you are threatened not entirely by AI on its own, but by less expert workers who are assisted by AI and therefore can do your job, whereas before they were unable to do your job. And the threat, that is a symbolic threat, not a realistic threat. You won't lose your job, but what you lose is the higher status that you have from being an expert that you've acquired from all those years of learning, which the people who don't have expertise but have AI to help them are now able to do it much better. There is a lot of discussion about whether AI is more beneficial to people who have more expertise or more beneficial to people who have less expertise. I'm aware of one study that has shown that more expert workers benefit more from AI, but the vast majority of the research is showing that it's the less expert workers who benefit the most from AI, and it's status leveling, that non-experts can do things that the experts used to be the only ones who were able to do. So that is a form of symbolic threat. And what we found in our survey, in a broad survey across multiple professions, and I just presented in Copenhagen a couple of days ago, was evidence that, that professionals, people who consider themselves experts and who are identified with a profession, feel very highly threatened, not so much by AI itself, but by non-experts replacing them and taking away the benefit of the expertise that they have. What we were interested in is to look at, and I'm going to share with you, so after the sort of survey, when people experience, what do people feel like if they have a prototypicality threat, if they have this symbolic threat, your reaction to a symbolic threat is it's a moral affront. You feel like you are it's wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong about this. It's not the way the world is supposed to work. And so it tends to elicit moral opposition. It's, this should not be allowed. And gatekeeping, which in this form is support for policies that prevent non-experts from getting into expert work, policies that would, unionization, certifications, all kinds of things that would basically keep out non-experts. We found evidence in a broad survey that people were doing that. But we also found evidence, so in some professions, it's already happening. And writers were a group that we studied relatively early on, because writers, when Gen AI started, it really affected writing very fundamentally. Their work, journalists, SEO writers, technical writers, all kinds of people were especially freelance writers who don't have jobs unless they can sort of claim their, they have to offer a price. There's a proposal for a job, and they have to offer, here's how much I'm willing to do it for. And the expert writers were having competition from non-expert writers. We looked to see what they did, and we found that freelance writers were very quickly learning how to compete with Gen AI. And they explicitly told us, we are doing certain activities in order to compete. And there were basically two different forms, two different dimensions. So they were choosing either to use AI only enough, basically not use AI, learn about AI, what it could do or couldn't do, and then do everything without AI, but that would differentiate themselves from AI. That's rivalry. That's what we call rivalry, as opposed to collaboration is using AI extensively in their work. And they could either choose the rivalry or collaboration to expand their role, or to delegate, to kind of focus their role. So approach is when the role expansion, or to focus their efforts only on the forms to get rid of the parts of the job that they didn't enjoy doing. So some of the activities, and a lot of what we found, was that the rivalry, especially rivalry with role expansion, very often involved other people. So for example, writers would collaborate with other writers in order to do a larger, more integrated work that AI would be less good at. So for example, a UX, that's user experience researchers collaborating with user experience writers to offer a combined work that AI can't replicate. Or graphic designers working with journalists so that they could offer something that AI, that was more multifaceted that AI couldn't compete with. They were engaging in community building and networking with other writers in order to differentiate themselves. Self-publishing in order to differentiate themselves and have their name associated with the work. So all kinds of things that were efforts to differentiate themselves from the non-experts who were equipped with AI. They also they realized that AI was less good at localization. So on the side of role streamlining, narrowing down their focus, they said, for example, journalists said, well, AI is very good at the stories that are the most popular stories, but local stories where you have to know the internal community, AI doesn't do very well at, and I can take advantage of my local knowledge and focus on that and therefore be able to do something different than AI. Or focus on artisanship, a poet, an artist, focused on, well, I do things that are very customized, and they were taking jobs only that allowed them to do things that could not be done by AI. And then there was another set of writers for whom they pretty much were heavily using AI, but the way that they used it was to offload tasks that they didn't enjoy to AI so that they could do more work at lower prices. And those are the folks who lowered their prices and would use AI to do things. So very much like the role expansion that I gave you the example of working with another person for role expansion. They would use AI to offer more end-to-end services where they were having AI do the work that was outside of their area of expertise. So some examples of how people learn to differentiate and compete with AI. I'm going to switch a little bit now to the issue of organizational learning. So the question here is, when we are moving from humans to humans plus AI, how do organizations learn? Well, first I need to tell you about what we already know. Existing theory about organizational learning suggests that there are 4 steps to organizational learning. First, an organization, and when I think about organizational learning, here you should be thinking about innovation and adaptation. But when the organizational part is where the whole organization, a collective effort at innovation and adaptation. The first step is to search for, you have problems and you have to define those problems. Very often management defines the problems. And then you go out and look for solutions, possible solutions, new technologies, new offerings, ways of addressing your existing problems. Then knowledge is created, you bring it into the organization and you create your own applications, ideally scalable applications, where you transform the information that you searched for externally into experience and usable knowledge. Very often this requires experimentation. Generally, knowledge creation requires experimentation. You have a prototype, you experiment, you experiment to develop the prototype, experiment until you can make it work, until it starts to create some benefit. Then if you've identified for an organization, once you have a working prototype, you've created knowledge in one area, a key thing that enables an organization to adapt is when the knowledge, the innovation in one part of the organization is transferred to another part of the organization. That enables the adaptation to be the organization to get better and better faster. And finally, the key step is knowledge retention. So you have to retain knowledge because knowledge inherently decays. So you lose knowledge, whatever you're not using regularly and reinforcing regularly decays. There are key ways of retaining knowledge, which involves embedding that knowledge in people, in the design of tasks, and in technology tools. That's usually how you retain knowledge. What we know from existing research on organizational learning is that knowledge is scarce. There's relatively little, it's very challenging for organizations to learn. And the reasons why are, when it comes to searching for knowledge, not everybody in an organization is capable of going out and understanding new information. And so it tends to be concentrated, the search for knowledge tends to be concentrated. Usually managers define the problem, and a small group of researchers goes out and looks for the solutions. And then they have to translate those solutions that they found to make them appropriate for the people that are actually going to have to do the work. So that is a first set of challenges with knowledge search. And people tend to look only at what is very close to them, only in areas that they're already familiar. So it's very hard to learn the more path-breaking knowledge are things that people with an area of expertise in an organization don't necessarily look for. Then they have to, with knowledge creation, it is very costly to invent things. It's costly to iterate. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And very often, it requires tacit knowledge that isn't articulated already. And so making that tacit knowledge explicit in order to be able to, create an innovation is a real challenge. Knowledge transfer is very challenging and is scarce because knowledge is sticky. You have not invented here syndrome. I don't know if you folks talk about that. We talk about that all the time. If it doesn't sound right, if it doesn't fit perfectly in my context, then I'm going to resist that knowledge. So knowledge very often does not transfer. Even from one unit to another in an organization, it's very hard to get innovations adapted across organizational units. And finally, knowledge retention is challenging because knowledge decays, as I said. People leave and all the knowledge that they had goes with them. Routines, you maybe have a standard operating procedure, but it doesn't take into account the way the world has changed. And so those routines are not updated. And one of the problems is that you want to keep the good knowledge and you want to get rid of outdated knowledge. And the problem is that actually outdated knowledge is inertial. It doesn't decay fast enough. We still keep doing things the old way because we were comfortable with them, and we don't adopt the new way. So these 4 processes are the issues that we were seeking to change with this organizational learning with AI. So the question we have here is kind of how does that change with AI? And it's important to understand what makes AI different from an organizational standpoint. From an organizational standpoint, AI is distinct because it combines, there are many reasons that AI is different, but AI combines these 3 characteristics. Number 1, it is a general purpose technology. In that sense, it's like electricity or the internet. It is inherently an enabling and adaptable technology, kind of a platform, and you can do many things with it. It's not a specific, it doesn't have a specific use. If I make an MRI machine, people will use it for MRIs. But AI can be used for many different reasons. And that's an opportunity for organizations. Anything that's a general purpose technology, the inventors, the innovators who create the technology, who created those LLMs, who created the large language models, the foundation models, there are too many uses for those models that they don't have enough time and manpower to create the applications for. And so it creates opportunities for other organizations and for other people to invent new things and to take the value, to kind of capture the value, to charge money for the ways that they have built on a foundation model or built on an LLM, but applied it in a very particular way, which creates value. So it's a general purpose technology. Second, AI creates new methods of invention. So there are new ways of innovating that AI offers because it has these powerful mechanisms for recombination and randomness built into it that changes the invention process, where you can use the machine to bring this recombination and randomness in and kind of come up with new things. And finally, it can learn on its own. That is a critical factor where it can keep on developing and I'm giving it too much credit, but basically the AI is designed, is coded and developed to improve autonomously. So what does this mean for this should be a tremendous opportunity for organizational innovation and adaptation. But my argument to you here is that that only happens, AI on its own does not do anything. In an organization, AI requires, to get any innovation with AI, you need actors and institutions. And you have to have the combination of what the technology can do along with actors who are motivated and have their own skills, and then appropriate enabling institutions that the combination of those three is what allows organizational innovation and adaptation to happen. I'm gonna tell you, basically the bottom line of my story is that AI creates, sort of what I'm gonna try to convince you of in the next 15 minutes or 15, 20 minutes, is that AI creates opportunities for shifting what I was just showing you as knowledge scarcity, the fact that knowledge, there are all kinds of challenges and obstacles to knowledge, to organizational learning. Instead, it creates knowledge abundance. And actually, it'll create knowledge abundance in search. It's enabling to search, to knowledge creation, and to knowledge transfer for different reasons. But at the same time as it creates lots of valuable knowledge, it also creates lots of risky knowledge. And so it actually requires that we no longer think as much about knowledge retention, but actually think about how we can reduce the risky knowledge so that we can leave enough space for the valuable knowledge to flourish in our organizations. So let me tell you about how this happens, and I'm going to basically describe a study that I was involved with since 2022. So late 2022, I started working with the predictive analytics unit in a hospital that I'll call Northeast Hospital, located in New York City. It's a very large health system. It has 6 hospitals, 2 schools of medicine, 300 offices, thousands, tens of thousands of employees. The Gen AI initiatives in this hospital began in the spring of 2023, so a couple of years ago. What I did is interviews, observations, and collaborative research projects with doctors and developers and data scientists at the hospital. And I'll give you the bottom line. It unleashed an enormous number of valuable innovations. Over this predictive analytics unit was responsible for 7 years prior to Gen AI. They were able to bring into deployment 36 models over 7 years. In the space of 15 months, from August 2023 to November 2024, over 100 new Gen AI-powered applications, innovations, were put into operation in this hospital system. So a dramatic increase in the level of innovation and adaptation happening, and I want to describe how that happened. First, we have that question. Remember, first stage is knowledge search. The goal that the hospital set is to spark widespread knowledge of Gen AI and experimentation with it. To have as many people in as many different roles as possible experimenting with Gen AI, instead of having it be focused with just the data scientists. So before, with predictive AI, basically someone would say, we need an application that does this. And they would assign it to the developers, and the developers would go out and find the data and create the model and try to implement it. And that was a very time-consuming process. And what the hospital system wanted to do, the health system wanted to do, is to give everyone Gen AI expertise and expertise and best practices, and have everyone coming up with ideas and trying to experiment with them. The reason that they saw that was the goal is because they realized there was a challenge. That the knowledge of the problems, the things that needed fixing, the places where innovations would be valuable, was diffuse. It was doctors had that knowledge, nurses had that knowledge, not the data scientists. And the doctors and nurses and finance professionals and HR professionals and the legal department, all of the finance department, all of these different departments, they knew what was wrong, but they didn't have the knowledge of the AI tools. And we thought, wait, this is the kind of tool that maybe we could share with them and they could be part of the innovation process, where they had been left out up until that point. The problem is, of course, that these folks didn't know how to use Gen AI safely. They didn't know how to use it. They didn't know how to use it safely. So what we did to overcome scarcity in search is we realized Gen AI has specific technological capabilities. It is democratizing. And so what you're going to keep hearing me say is like, what is it about Gen AI? We have to be specific about what Gen AI, how is Gen AI different in order to understand how its power can be unleashed. So Gen AI, with respect to search, it's different in two ways. It is democratizing because it's very easy to use. You don't need to be able to code. You can give it commands in English. And it doesn't require infrastructure. You can access it from your laptop, from your telephone, from your phone. It also, a second quality of Gen AI is that it's creational, that it can produce novel outputs on its own and kind of surprise you with what it comes up with, because it has the power of this large language, this big data foundation model behind it. But then on its own, those characteristics would not do anything. It requires being used by actors in the right context. So the actors in this case were these decentralized domain experts. Think about, again, doctors, nurses, finance professionals, legal professionals, operations folks, all of these kinds of folks. And they know the problems and they know what's a good solution. They're the ones who have that intuition, remember from the Dreyfus model, they're the experts in their area. They know what is a solution that meets the standards that will be used. And developers have their skills and knowledge. They know what Gen AI can be used for, what its capabilities are, and how to apply it safely and effectively, meaning that it won't have all the problems hallucinations and bias and all of these issues that we know are true with Gen AI because of its randomness. So together, the team that I was working with came up with this idea of a promptathon. The very first as background, we created our own Gen AI model, a safe, secure, private Gen AI model that was also had access to all the data that the health system had on patients and on treatment and on billing and all of that kind of stuff. So we started out with that model. We had it ready to go by June of 2023, a preliminary version. It's continuing to develop. But then we basically then we wanted people to know how to use it. And this promptathon, the first one, we just thought of a single one, but it turned into a whole series. We said, anyone want to learn about Gen AI? Sign up. We'll give you a morning of instruction, like novices, like classroom instruction. We'll tell you how it works. We'll tell you what's safe, what's not safe. We'll tell you what are good best practices in terms of prompting. So a morning of instruction. But then in the afternoon, we're going to pair groups of domain experts in their areas with data scientists. And you bring your own data about your problems, and we will workshop those problems in the promptathon. There was overwhelming interest in the very first promptathon. There were 445 people who signed up and attended, the 445 people across the health system who signed up and attended because everyone was curious, and this is true in your organizations too. Everyone is curious about generative AI, and if you're willing to educate them on it, they want to learn. So they signed up. We couldn't do workshops with all of them, so we selected the first 100 for that first promptathon, but then we did a series of workshops, department by department, where we would bring together the data scientists from the predictive analytics unit, this center of excellence, along with the people, the domain experts in their departments, and we brought them together and they would come up with ideas and just, workshop, okay, how would you try to use Gen AI to solve this problem? So that combination of the three was a tremendous success. It created, so I have a couple of quotes here from the director of the Center of Excellence, for example, who described what a promptathon is. That a promptathon is, we take people who don't know anything about GPT and we make it relevant for them. We continue to build on this idea of making AI available to the entire organization. The key thing here is bring in domain experts who don't think of themselves as developers, because Gen AI can turn them into developers. And so what are the possibilities of what people can do with some of their own data? And the vendor, in this case it was Microsoft, who helped us to develop that very first foundation model, LLM, that we based it on, recognized that this was a cultural change. He said, a lot of what we thought at Microsoft, what we thought we were going to be doing with with training people on AI was like what we do for Excel or Word, where we teach them, here's how you use it. But we realize when it comes to Gen AI that it's very different from using Office. It's a culture change. Each organization has to speak to its own people and let them know we want you to experiment. The outcome of this set of promptathons was a large and diverse array of use cases, possibilities for what Gen AI could be used for, and I'll give you some examples. So doctors in the emergency department had to create basically a handoff note that would allow them to transition a patient from the emergency department into the hospital who needed to be admitted. And Gen AI could do the drafting, the first draft of those notes. Insurance companies, there's a constant argument between the hospital that wants to bill, and at least in the United States, we have the hospitals want to bill for their services, and the insurance companies have to decide if they're willing to pay the bill or not. And they very often will say, no, I'm not willing to pay this. And that requires a lot of time to sort of make the argument, make the argument for why that the bills should be paid. And we were using Gen AI, so one of the other ideas was use Gen AI to create rebuttal letters to the insurance companies. Use Gen AI to draft feedback. So one of the other things is this hospital, I said, has 2 medical schools. The students in medical schools do rotations, and you have to, the regulator that certifies doctors requires that at every rotation, preceptors, so those are the people who kind of oversee the medical students, have to give feedback, evaluate the medical students in terms of their capabilities. And then you have to integrate all of these preceptor notes across many different people who are kind of guiding the doctors. And Gen AI could take all those preceptor notes and create an integrated kind of learning, here's what you're good at, here's what you still need to improve, here's how you could accomplish that. Take all of these notes from many different people and pull them all together into a synthesized whole. And these are the kinds of innovations that came out of even this very first promptathon. So that's what came, again, a combination of domain experts and developers are the actors, Gen AI's democratizing and creational capabilities, along with the institutional phenomenon of promptathons, and then we have, I am losing track of time. I think that maybe I'll very briefly with, knowledge creation was kind of this next step, coming up with a way of defining these use cases and solution prototypes. The challenge was that you have to understand Gen AI and the task, and that requires tacit knowledge that is held by domain experts who can't articulate it in very clear ways. What we did is we combined the domain experts and developers with on-demand assistant, virtual office hours, and took advantage of the fact that Gen AI is conversational. You can prompt it and it gives you different responses. In the process of prompting Gen AI and getting the responses, you discover, you take tacit knowledge and make it explicit. The prompts themselves are a way for people to say what it is that is wrong or right, and then you can read the prompts and understand what needs to be changed. We found that this combination of domain experts iterating with their prompts lowered the cost of experimentation and made it possible for a large array of domain experts to articulate what they could improve And in this case, it allowed them to communicate better to developers what's right and what's wrong, which was tacit knowledge that only they knew. And it allowed them to create much better outcomes and work better with the developers, not, doing a lot more of it themselves. I apologize. I just lost track of where my time was. I think what I want to do is I'm going to skip to the key kind of issue of it. We also realized that Gen AI had some downsides. It created It can do things effectively, but in some cases not do things effectively. So it has errors, and a lot of times our domain experts didn't know what were the errors with AI, what were the risks of using AI. For example, it does not translate. It's great at translating into other languages, but not all languages, especially figurative languages like Asian language, character-based languages. It's terrible at doing that effectively. And if you can't read if you want to translate medical information into a language that you can't be sure that it's translated it correctly, that's too risky. And so we found that basically we used Gen AI. We recognized that Gen AI had weaknesses that weren't always available, domain experts didn't know them. And we incorporated a risk screen that allowed the experts to recognize which were the Gen AI solutions that the technology was not good enough, or the data that we had was not good enough to be able to go into production, and we preemptively removed those so that they were less likely, so that we could focus only on the ones that would be productive. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. The overall effect is that Gen AI made search, knowledge creation, and knowledge transfer much easier. So created an abundance of scalable knowledge, but at the same time, it created risky knowledge. And we used Gen AI's capabilities, including things like guardrailing capabilities and this curating, this risk screen, to eliminate the risky knowledge. I'm gonna, so it's going from scarcity to abundance. I'm just gonna quickly, end with some new directions. I think that there are some contextual factors. People use Gen AI either as a personal assistant, three different options. You can use Gen AI as a personal assistant, like on your phone, you're asking it questions, you as an individual. You can use Gen AI in these vendor-provided mechanisms where it's AI meeting summaries, sentence completion. You don't even know that Gen AI is being used. Or you can use it in the way that this hospital did, as a scalable mechanism for innovation. The key thing about that last form is that it brings teams of people together to develop innovations that they have to work together to create. That, I think, is my hypothesis, is that the third form, where members of an organization collaboratively have to generate AI solutions, is going to be the most valuable one, but it is also the least common. People are mostly getting Gen AI solutions from vendors, which they aren't developing themselves and aren't perfect for them, or they're getting it, or they're using it as a personal assistant, very often not even telling other people that they're using it. And those are the less effective and less efficient forms, and often risky forms. And so using it as an organizational learning tool, my hypothesis is that that would be the most effective. Some other questions are AI is evolving very rapidly. We have moved from predictive AI, what I was telling you about at the beginning, to LLMs, now to multimodal AI, and to AI agents is the new thing that the hospital is focusing on. And the problem is that prompting, AI, human learning about how to use AI is where the frictions and problems are. Prompting is being removed. People are being removed in this process. As we move from predictive AI to LLMs to AI agents, what is being removed is the role of people in structuring it. And so we have a window that we have to be taking advantage of this. How do identity and learning and innovation change as we move to these mechanisms where people have much less control? And the last thing is, what does this mean for our social networks? One of the things that we know is that AI is used by people for areas where they don't know. People use it not for things that they're expert in, but actually for the things that they are not expert in. And that is where so much risk comes, because they are not able to edit it. They don't know that it's not good enough. And one of the reasons that they do that is because it's much more threatening to ask experts when you are, AI is less threatening than experts are. And so one of our questions is, what happens to an organization's mechanisms for innovation, their networks, their coordination, and their transactive memory of knowing who knows what, if people use AI for these purposes? So that's maybe the answer.
All right. Thank you, Professor Weisenfeld.